You know what it feels like. That quiet moment late at night when you're scrolling through old photos or reading something you wrote a few years ago, and you don't recognize the person in them. Not because you've aged, but because the way you think, the things you cared about, the way you held yourself in the world, it all feels like a stranger wearing your face. There's a flicker of discomfort, a thought that surfaces without warning. Who am I, really? And then, almost immediately, another thought follows. Maybe this time I'll figure it out. So you begin again. You find a new way to dress, a new hobby, a new set of beliefs. You tell yourself this version is more authentic, more aligned. And for a few weeks it feels like relief, like you've finally arrived. But then, somewhere down the road, the feeling creeps back. The sense that this skin doesn't quite fit either. And so you rewrite, again and again. It's exhausting, isn't it? Not just the effort of changing, but the weight of wondering why you can't just stay someone. Why everyone else seems to have a solid sense of who they are, while you feel like a draft being edited over and over. You start to wonder if there's something fundamentally unstable about you, if you're broken in some way, if you'll ever feel whole. Let's look at how this plays out in ordinary moments. You meet someone new, and you feel the familiar pull to curate yourself. You hold back your real opinion because you're not sure if it belongs to you yet. You test out a new laugh. You mention interests that you've only recently adopted, hoping they'll land. And later, when you're alone, there's a hollow feeling. Not because the conversation went badly, but because you're not sure who was actually in it. You wonder if you're being fake. But it doesn't feel like faking. It feels like searching, like trying on lives until one doesn't itch. This isn't just about social awkwardness. It seeps into the big decisions too. You choose a career path, only to feel a year later that it belongs to a version of you that no longer exists. You end relationships because you've outgrown the person you were when you started them. You move cities, change philosophies, rewrite your entire origin story. And each time you tell yourself this is growth. And maybe some of it is. But beneath the growth, there's something else. A quiet, persistent fear that you'll never actually land. That you're not becoming someone, you're just escaping someone. Over and over. This pattern has a name. It's called identity diffusion. And it's not a sign that you're broken. It's a sign that your brain is trying to solve a problem it was never designed to solve alone. Here's what's really happening. Your brain is a prediction engine. It's constantly building a model of who you are based on feedback, from your actions, from your relationships, from the world's reactions to you. This model is what psychologists call the self-concept. And it's not a fixed thing. It's more like a story the brain tells itself to reduce uncertainty. The brain hates uncertainty. It craves a coherent narrative because coherence means safety. When the story of who you are feels fragmented or contradictory, your brain experiences that as a threat, a low-grade chronic threat. And so it does what it's wired to do. It searches for a new story. But here's the catch. When you don't have a stable internal reference point, a way to test whether a new story actually fits, your brain has no anchor. So it starts looking for external anchors. How do others see me? What identity gets the most approval? What role feels the safest? And this is where the rewriting begins. Not because you lack a self, but because your brain is using the wrong map. It's treating identity like a costume you can pick based on external feedback, rather than a structure you build from the inside out. This is why the relief never lasts. External validation is a temporary signal. It doesn't create coherence, it creates dependence. Each time you rewrite your personality based on a new environment, a new relationship, a new ideal, you're teaching your brain that the self is something to be constructed from the outside in. And the more you do it, the harder it becomes to feel solid. So let's reframe what's happening. You are not unstable. You are not a fraud. What you are is someone who has learned, probably early on, that safety comes from adaptation. Maybe you grew up in an environment where being yourself wasn't safe. Maybe you learned that love was conditional on fitting a certain mold. Maybe you were praised for being easy, for being agreeable, for being what others needed.
And your brilliant, adaptable brain took that in and built a survival strategy. Become whoever you need to be in order to be safe. This is not a personality flaw. This is a form of intelligence. It's a strategy that once protected you, but now it's creating the very instability it was meant to prevent, because the brain is still operating under an old rule. Coherence comes from fitting in. But true coherence, the kind that doesn't unravel, comes from something else entirely. To understand how to break the cycle, we have to look at the neuroscience of identity. There's a region in your brain called the prefrontal cortex. It's responsible for what's known as self-representation, the ability to hold a stable sense of who you are across time. But this region doesn't work in isolation. It relies on input from what's called the autobiographical memory system, which stores the story of your life. When these two systems are well integrated, you feel like a continuous person. You can look at your past self and feel a sense of connection, even if you've changed. But here's what happens when identity rewriting becomes a pattern. Each time you discard a version of yourself, you're not just changing your behavior, you're fragmenting your autobiographical memory. You're telling your brain, that past self wasn't really me. And when you do that repeatedly, your brain loses the thread. It stops being able to construct a coherent narrative. So you end up with a collection of selves, like a box of photographs that don't belong to the same album. And without a narrative thread, the prefrontal cortex has nothing to hold on to. So it keeps searching, keeps rewriting, keeps trying to find a story that finally feels true. This is why no amount of external reinvention will ever solve the problem, because the issue isn't the content of your identity, it's the relationship you have to your own continuity. So what actually works? If rewriting your personality isn't the path to coherence, what is? The first step is to stop asking, "Who am I?" and start asking, "What do I consistently do?" This shifts the brain's focus from identity as a noun, a fixed thing to be discovered, to identity as a verb, a pattern of actions. The brain builds self-concept from behavior, not the other way around. You don't think your way into being a certain person, you act your way into becoming them. So instead of trying to define yourself, start tracking what you do when no one's watching. What do you return to? What do you choose when there's no audience? That's not your whole identity, but it's your anchor. It's the data your brain needs to start building a stable model. For example, let's say you've been rewriting your interests depending on who you're around. Instead of trying to decide what your real interests are, you commit to a single practice, something small, like writing for 10 minutes every morning, and you do it regardless of who you're becoming that week. You're not trying to define yourself as a writer, you're simply giving your brain consistent data. This is what I do. Over time, that repetition builds a neural pathway, and that pathway becomes the foundation of a stable self.
The second step is to stop discarding past selves. This is crucial. Every time you say, "That wasn't really me," you fragment your narrative. Instead, you practice integration. You look at a past version of yourself, maybe the version that cared deeply about something you now find embarrassing, and you say, "That was me. I don't have to be her anymore, but she was me." This is not about agreeing with your past self. It's about claiming her, because the brain cannot build coherence from rejection. It builds coherence from inclusion. When you include your past selves in the story, you give the prefrontal cortex the raw material it needs to weave a continuous thread. You stop being a collection of fragments and become a person who is changed. A concrete way to do this is to keep a simple journal of continuity, not a diary of daily events, but a record of what you've carried forward. Once a week, write down one thing from your past that you still value, even if it looks different now. A value, a memory, a lesson. This trains your brain to look for threads rather than breaks. The third step is to shift from external mirroring to internal referencing. Most people who rewrite their personalities are highly attuned to external cues. They read the room, adjust, perform. This is not deception, it's hypervigilance, but it keeps the self anchored outside the body.
To reverse this, you practice what psychologists call interoceptive awareness, the ability to notice what you feel in your own body independent of context. Before you adapt to a room, you pause for 3 seconds and ask, "What do I feel right now?" Not "what should I feel," but what is present. This is small, but it's radical, because you're teaching your brain that the first source of information is internal. Over time, this builds what's called self-referential processing, the brain's ability to use internal signals as the primary guide for identity. In practice, this might look like pausing before you answer a question about what you believe. You don't rush to give the version that fits the moment. You check in. You say, "Let me think about that." And you allow the answer to emerge from inside, even if it's messy, even if it doesn't perfectly align with the group. This is uncomfortable at first, but each time you do it, you strengthen the neural circuits that support a stable self. The fourth and final step is to create what's called a coherence practice. This is a structured way to reflect on your own continuity. It could be a weekly review where you ask yourself, what did I do this week that felt aligned? What did I do that felt like a performance? And importantly, where did I feel the same as I did last year? Not the same in terms of interests, but the same in terms of core sensations. What felt meaningful? What felt like integrity? This practice helps your brain integrate experiences over time, strengthening the narrative thread. The fifth and final step is to redefine what authenticity means. Most people think authenticity means expressing whatever impulse arises in the moment. But psychologically, authenticity is not spontaneity, it's alignment. It's the reduction of conflict between your actions and your stated values. And values are not identities. Values are directions. They're not something you find, they're something you choose and then test through behavior. So instead of asking, "Who am I?" you start asking, "What direction do I want to move in?" This simple shift changes everything, because directions don't require you to be a finished person. They only require you to take one step that aligns with a value. And over time, those steps become the most stable structure you'll ever build.
Let's bring this all together with a simple mental model. Imagine your identity is not a statue you're trying to carve into its final form. It's a river. And for years, you've been trying to freeze the river into a shape you can point to and call real. But the river keeps moving, and you think this means something is wrong with you. What you're actually missing is the banks. A river without banks doesn't flow anywhere. It becomes a flood. Your values, your consistent actions, your willingness to include your past selves, these are the banks. They don't stop the river from flowing, they give it a direction. And within that direction, you can change, you can grow, you can reinvent. But you're no longer reinventing the entire riverbed every time. You're simply flowing within a form that holds you. This is what coherence feels like. Not a fixed identity, but a contained flow. You don't have to know exactly who you are. You just have to know what you're moving toward and what you're willing to carry with you from before. The rest can change. The rest will change. And that's not a sign of instability. That's the sign of a person who has finally stopped fighting the current. So if you've been rewriting your personality, trying on versions of yourself like drafts of a letter you never send, you can stop now. Not because you found the final version, but because you no longer need to. The question was never who are you? The question is what are you building toward? And the answer doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be yours.